Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin, and we are here with our 71st episode. It's crazy how many episodes it's been doing this show. It's a real blessing, everybody. But we are here discussing the Third World War again. We are covering all fronts again this week, all sorts of things going on as Russia rapidly advances in Ukraine, taking villages on all fronts in effectively every oblast in which they have control or partial control, I believe, besides Kherson. Everywhere else has seen gains. We are also seeing huge escalations around the world in the rhetorical battle over Israel and Palestine as the U.S. campus protests heat up and spread across the nation, and we see state, city, federal police deployed to deal with these things. We're seeing snipers on the roof to point at college students. It's crazy. So we're going to cover all of this. Of course, the craziness going on in Armenia with the Tuvash region and the border towns being exchanged between Armenia and Azerbaijan, as well as, of course, the strikes on Rafah and the ongoing situation as these refugee camps are being made in parts of Gaza to prepare for Israel's impending operation, which Netanyahu has been dangling in front of everybody's faces for weeks now as this bargaining chip. We're of course also going to talk about the huge aid bill as well as the big arrests in the Russian military industrial complex and a whole host of other issues. So Dmitry, with all of that, how are you doing?
Doing wonderful. It's good to be here to discuss the news this week. And as you've mentioned, Middle Eastern news we've been on the cusp of this tragedy, or the escalation of the tragedy, for a few months now, on end since October, and it doesn't seem to let go of us, especially this looming new step, this invasion of the Rafah refugee camp in the south of the Gaza Strip, which is 40 kilometers long, and all the refugees, all the innocent Palestinians essentially have gathered in the south there, which we've been discussing for a few weeks now. But what we're seeing is Netanyahu has been waiting for a few weeks, essentially waiting for a green light. And I'm not sure from who. Is it from Ben Gvir? Is it from his partners in the US? Is it from the European Union, NATO? We're not too sure exactly what's stopping the impending Rafah invasion, especially since this recent exchange between Iran and Israel, which we covered the last fortnight or so. Because notice now that the strikes are over, suddenly Israel does have essentially the potential to go into Rafah and not exactly seek retaliation, because the exchange has taken place and essentially the chess pieces have been exchanged on the board. So it would look slightly unfair even for Iran to retaliate at this point, and suddenly Israel and the Palestinians are left one-on-one. Of course, the innocent Palestinians barely armed, and the Israelis can do as they please in Rafah. So we are kind of awaiting this impending invasion. Of course, it's accommodated by recent strikes in Rafah. So this is kind of telling. This is pointing towards the fact that Netanyahu doesn't actually wish to find a peaceful solution with the remnants of Hamas. And we mean remnants because a lot of Hamas leaders have already been killed. And in fact, when we speak about the hostages, which allegedly Hamas already hold, Conrad, you have voiced the idea that perhaps the hostages are already dead, killed either initially during the hostage crisis itself or even by Israeli bombardment thereafter, because we really haven't seen any proof that the hostages are even alive. And in fact, the hostages at this point are just, as you said, like political bargaining tool used by not even, but I wouldn't even say both sides. They're used mainly by Western media sources as well as the Hebrew Zionist sources in their media news, justifying the entire, essentially, collaborative genocide of Palestinians in Gaza. So they're saying, oh, the hostages, we need to rescue them, painting this as this counter-terrorist massive operation, when in fact it's something else. It's like a clearing of land, a genocide of the local populace of Palestine. So it's quite clear that, given the recent US aid bill, that Netanyahu is not going to be held back. There were no deals given from the US. There were no guarantees, right? There were no documents signed between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu that, well, perhaps Rafah will not be attacked. The green light, I suppose, implicitly has already been provided to Netanyahu. So we're just a wait for his sort of whomever in his cabinet to sort of put a plan together and actually strike the refugee camps and attack it head on. And we have seen bombardments on the outskirts in the last 2 days. Another 5 people have been killed in an airstrike on the outskirts of Gaza. Just like last week we reported, essentially just before the recording itself, bombardments take place every single day. But when the tanks do, of course, set their treads on forward speed and accelerate towards the camps, I don't think there'll be anything really to stop them, in fact. And seeing as Iran and Hezbollah at the moment seem to be preoccupied with sort of foreign geopolitical concerns, we can see a lot of countries have actually put pressure on Iran recently to actually not strike back at Israel. After this last week's strike, this is what we've seen in the media, that world peace. We've seen all these discussions. Meanwhile, Israel is still pressuring Palestine, and no one's really reacting. And Netanyahu's statement I'll just quickly read out a portion of it, with the ICC, of course, asking him to essentially stop the genocide taking place. He, of course, reacts to that by saying, under my leadership, Israel will never attempt and accept anything by the ICC that undermines its inherent right to self-defense. While the ICC will not affect Israel's action, it would be a dangerous precedent that threatens the soldiers and officials of the democracies fighting savage terrorism and wanton aggression. Netanyahu is painting the Hamas and the innocent Palestinians as terrorists, kind of blatantly, openly, and this, of course, gives him apparent legitimacy to continue his lawless actions. The same is happening, of course, in southern Lebanon, Conrad, where indiscriminate bombardment of Lebanese towns and villages is taking place by the Israeli Air Force. Of course, Hezbollah, which are the active anti-Israeli group operating in southern Lebanon, do not have any air force whatsoever, and in fact, probably don't even have the equipment. We've discussed how Russians are potentially selling anti-air missiles and systems to the Hezbollah forces. Most likely, those systems not in place yet. They haven't. The Hezbollah troops have not been trained on how to use them, and so the Israeli Air Force continues to bombard the allegedly Hezbollah stationed bases and points in southern Lebanon. So we've seen at least 40 strikes over the last year. 40 strikes is quite significant. That's almost 3 per day. So it's getting quite rough, I would say, all over the Levant, and we're kind of in anticipation, waiting for the next big news. And of course, the next news most likely will be the Israeli ground invasion of Rafah. And it would almost, as if by chance, and we know nothing really happens by chance in the plans of these globalists, it may even coincide with Easter, of course, which would be an incredible tragedy given the Christians in Gaza, the Christians in the refugee camp itself, as well as their peaceful celebration of Easter, which is upcoming just in a week's time.
Yeah, we're looking forward to Palm Sunday. Of course, that'll be when this episode is released. So happy Palm Sunday to those of you listening as this drops. And then, of course, we have Pascha coming up. And you mentioned the Holy Land. We will be awaiting the descent of the Holy Fire as well, and keeping the current events, I guess, in mind as we witness that happen in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. But this is from Middle East Spectator, quoting Hebrew media. They say Hezbollah crossed a clear red line today by striking in Accra, but Netanyahu is reluctant to act against Hezbollah out of fear of an all-out war, which he does not want, at least not before the Rafah operation. Of course, this is a few days ago, earlier this week. Hezbollah was striking deeper and deeper into Israel on the coast, on some of these towns, well into, on the coast where there are civilians and there was all sorts of other targets. And it's very clear that the Rafah operation is being used as this bartering chip with the West, because they know that, they could go in at any time and the West doesn't want them to, because in many ways Hezbollah perhaps will be triggered when the Rafah operation begins. So they're trying to balance all of this out as, the Iranians are facing all sorts of international pressure. Of course, Ansar Allah, the Houthis, they're still keeping their pressure on. Just recently, as of this being recorded, same day, they struck a British oil tanker, and it's also been reported that they downed a MQ-9 Reaper drone over the Red Sea. So the Houthis are not going away. Again, it seems that their blockade attempts and their, missile strikes have been working, as the U.S. has been forced to basically stop using the stick and bring out the carrot and try to get them to, come to the table and negotiate and stop the blockade, allow traffic to start flowing freely through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal and all of these sorts of things, because they wanted to say, we'll recognize you, we will take you off the terrorist list, we will perhaps recognize the Ansar Allah government in Sana'a and all of that. So it's clear that they are having an effect, and they have no interest in that. They are interested in stopping the genocide in Gaza, which, as you said, Dimitri, we hear a lot of bluster from both sides. We hear talk about international courts. We hear diplomats exchanging and visiting. But at the end of the day, the genocide still continues. So that's part of the whole game, right? Is fogging everything up while everything still goes on. So people kind of forget about the details. But that's part of why the protests in the U.S. have gotten so intense, right? Because people realize that despite the widespread awareness of this issue on social media, I mean, I know a lot of boomers that would otherwise be the most pro-Israel evangelicals of all time have been forced to reconcile with the fact that at the very least, some really serious nonsense is going on. Of course, we have Tucker Carlson waking up his audience of many boomers to the reality of Christian persecution in the Middle East, specifically by the Zionist regime. But in the U.S., while sure it is mostly a left-wing movement and a brown person Muslim, movement, in many ways, it's clear that it's a true threat to the system, because, I mean, Greg Abbott is mobilizing the state troopers of Texas to arrest them for anti-Semitism, which I wasn't aware was a crime as far as I was concerned. And again, being anti-Israel debatably quote unquote anti-Semitic regardless. So we're seeing it spread to all sorts of places. Ohio, New York, really where it started on Columbia University campus. Of course, we see stuff in California, but we see all these Jews coming up to these protests, like kind of counter protesting, like, I'm Jewish and I'm not afraid, and I'm, I guess, I don't know, proud of the genocide in Gaza. I don't really understand what the optics there are supposed to be, but these Palestinians are walking around with flags, and all these Jews are freaking out that this is another, night of broken glass, a Kristallnacht or something. Holocaust 2 is on the way. It's basically a pogrom. I'm hearing all of these sorts of things, but all I'm really seeing is, people walking around waving a Palestine flag, shouting pro-Palestinian slogans. Yet somehow, I guess we're in imminent danger of another mass Jewish persecution, which it all seems to be a bit paranoid, and it starts to make you wonder about, if this is what we're getting from this, what if this paranoid interpretation is what we're getting about other events that occurred throughout history, right? But I think as far as the protests go, I mean, Dimitri, you mentioned this off air, and I can't remember where this exactly was, but we're seeing blacked out vans, clearly feds, using all sorts of technology on the back of these vans, clearly gathering cell phone data, perhaps 3D mapping some of these city blocks. Who knows? Perhaps a false flag of some kind is being planned. We saw the sit-ins at Google by those leftist employees protesting in favor of Palestine, and they were all arrested. And like I said earlier, I believe it's on the roof of buildings around the campus of University of Indiana or somewhere in Ohio. I can't remember precisely, but they had snipers, full-on police snipers, just dialing it in, making sure they had sights on these college-age protesters. It's crazy. These kids are younger than me. I've been out of college for a few years now, and I'm here in Austin, Texas. We saw it at University of Texas. That video that I posted on the World War Now Telegram and on the Twitter, on my personal Twitter. Yeah, a friend of mine sent me that video. He took that live, showing a Texas State trooper beating the crap out of a cameraman. I guess it was like a Fox News cameraman or something like that, and doing all sorts of other things against these anti-Israel protesters at the University of Texas. And it's crazy. I mean, we're seeing responses from the Israeli government. The world is watching this, of course, which is a bit bizarre for sure. It's a bit of a momentous student movement, but nothing to the level of other protests or even student movements we've seen in the past. And Netanyahu's addressing it. He's saying that America's campuses have become besieged by anti-Semitic mobs, because a lot of these protesters are doing these sit-ins. They're occupying their campus lawns, their quads or these other things, setting up tents, and all sorts of things that are nowhere near as bad as what happened with BLM. But unlike BLM, the cops are moving in post haste, because if there's one thing we know that the police do stand for, it's for Jewish power. So when that starts to get threatened, it appears that all arms of American law enforcement and the military are mobilized immediately. Of course, the U.S. Navy always on guard, always on alert to protect Israel, no matter what they decide to do. And apparently on the home front, whenever Jews, stub their toe, the police forces of the United States will be there to arrest whoever they want to point the finger at. So with all of that being said, Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on the protests. We've heard Itamar Ben-Gvir, probably the most odious Kahanist in power. He was in a car accident. So what are your thoughts on this? Where are we going with this Israel-Iran World War III situation? It does not seem to be dying down anytime soon.
No, it doesn't seem to be dying down, but at the same time, the majority of the pressure is actually on, say, the axis of resistance to make the frontal move, because, well, Israel is still achieving its goals. It still exists. It's still pushing the genocide. It's still pushing its influence in the U.S., as seen in the barrels of the sniper rifles pointed at random Antifa and even left-wing protesters and right-wing protesters. It was actually quite a mixed crowd over there. But we are still seeing Israeli, shall we say, like Jewish Hasidic dominance in world affairs, right? We see it in Russia, we see it in the US, we see it in the Middle East. It continues to push this particular agenda forward. And of course, there are religious considerations, given that it is Passover week for them. And, there's a potential sacrifice of those red heifers, or perhaps the red heifer sacrifice already took place off camera. We're not exactly sure, what's happening on the Mount of Olives over there outside of Jerusalem. So there are these weird rituals taking place. At the same time, the protests in Israel, notice that nobody's really covering them. The fact that Ben-Gvir was nearly lynched by his own countrymen who were upset at what's happening in the country geopolitically. Ben-Gvir, of course, is the head of national security in Israel, essentially the chief of, probably related to Mossad and other of these cutthroat agencies. This guy is like the leader of the assassins, right? He's like the man on the mountain of Alamut fortress. So this is like a Jewish assassin leader, and he's almost getting lynched outside of his car. His car is crashing, like he'd just been in a car accident. There's unrest happening in Israel itself, but the media is not covering it. Instead, they're covering, oh, wow, look at these anti Semitic protesters. Let's bring around snipers. Let's bring around riot police because these college kids without any weapons whatsoever are a threat to society. And meanwhile, as you said, correctly speaking here, the BLM protests, which took place before the 2020-2021 election in the United States were completely allowed to, frolic around, causing destruction and dismay all over their particular towns and even, I would say, large cities. So all the damage caused by that was completely ignored. Meanwhile, this is given the view as if this is some sort of terrorist act by the essentially harmless college students at this point. It's similar to like Ben Shapiro debating college students with all this air and fiery nature, but not confronting somebody like a Nicholas J. Fuentes or like a Jay Dyer or some other Christian apologetic leader who would, again, oppose his views openly. So it's just that approach of anti-Semitism needs to be shut down completely, and that's the agenda will be pushed regardless of country. I mean, including the Russian Federation and countries like Ukraine, unfortunately. So anti-Semitism really isn't tolerated anywhere, and we see this as the sort of set agenda moving forward. And funny enough, it does reflect on geopolitics as well. Now, the really curious story, right, from the Middle East, from Israel, is while these protests are ongoing, there is a secret agenda, again, taking place with the U.S. sending 1,000 of its own troops. And these are, of course, your countrymen, people from various American towns being paid a regular military salary to construct a port off the coast of Gaza. So Israeli-occupied Gaza, they're building a port to bring in alleged humanitarian food and, food and drink and humanitarian aid, nutrition to the people of Gaza who are allegedly starving. So first you create the problem, then you bring the solution, right? And of course, this port, Lord forbid, the Hamas or some Palestinian Authority troops begin attacking this port because they see U.S. troops on their own soil. This will be, of course, an attack upon American sovereignty, on American personality. America will need to retaliate against Hamas and the Palestinians, whichever Palestinian group attacks the construction of this port on their own land without asking for their consent. This will cause even further escalation, and the Palestinians, again, will be the bad guys here. And of course, bringing around this port, allegedly stating that, well, there is actually a real humanitarian crisis, but allegedly stating that, well, we're here to solve it and resolve it. It really reminds me of what took place in the Russian Empire, or the former Russian Empire, once the Civil War was over, once Kolchak lost, Denikin left, Wrangel left Russia. The Bolsheviks suddenly were left with this country in disrepair, and all these famines were taking place. So what did they do in 1924, 1925? They started taking the goods from the churches, started melting down crosses, melting down gold, silver, chalices, things like that, taking all of the treasures stored in the Russian Orthodox Church over 1,000 years, taking them and essentially claiming that this is to resolve the local famine taking place in Russia, when in fact the majority of those treasures of the Orthodox Church were in fact sent overseas to Turkey to fund the revolution over there with Ataturk and all these other Jewish Freemasons, as well as perhaps even overseas to like the Federal Reserve or maybe somewhere in London. So none of this money went towards actually feeding the starving people. And so we see the same tactic of using famine and sort of the lack of humanitarian aid across a certain country to push a political agenda. We've seen this before. We see it again. It's the same signature. They don't really these people, they don't need to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. So it's really unfortunate this goes on and happens. And this recent deployment of snipers and reaction to the college protest, I think it clearly states that the US, under the Biden administration, perhaps even under Donald Trump, it is still their subsidiary country, right? The politicians, we do know who they obey. And when they feel threatened, even perhaps superficially speaking, right? Because these college protesters, they're not like right-wing people like us or even our listeners. They don't really have any political sort of, besides being pro-Palestinian and anti-genocide, they don't have any views which somehow would harm Israel, so to speak. They don't have any programs on how to reinvent America or how to change or how to, say, deport certain people. Perhaps they don't even want to defend the American border with Mexico. But because they are anti-Israeli, that suddenly harms Israeli interest, and suddenly we see oy vey, oy gewalt, suddenly there's a reaction. And it's even an overreaction. And they kind of, we do see the kipper from outside of the barricade, so it's quite clear who is making the decisions behind the scenes here. And so it's quite telling. Their overreaction, their arrogance will be their downfall, I think, in the long term, especially when countries in Eastern Europe begin waking up, Hungary, Belarus, Russia. There will be a complete, I would say, disclosing of exactly how these people act and how they conduct themselves domestically as well as in geopolitical foreign affairs.
Totally agree. You mentioned the pier being built. We are also seeing the construction of, I believe, 2 large refugee camps, one to the far west near the coast, a little bit north of Rafah, and then one near Khan Yunis. And we've seen the recent discovery of a mass grave in Khan Yunis with at least 700 people in it so far, claimed to be mostly women and children. So, more discoveries and evidences and, fallout of the Israeli genocide. But regarding escalations, we saw this on Thursday morning. This is from Al Jazeera. 700 Jewish settlers and Zionist extremists stormed Al Aqsa Mosque in the morning hours of the third day of the Jewish Passover. And we're hearing plans for new settlements in Gaza. Again, we still hear the plans for the settlements in Lebanon. We're hearing all this news about the two-state solution with Chinese support and Hamas claiming that they're willing to lay down all their arms and exist solely as a political party if two-state solution is on the table and everything. But Israel seems to have no interest in that. What is Israel going to do? Deploy the IDF to forcibly withdraw the hundreds of thousands of Jewish settlers in the West Bank? I do not see anybody, even the quote unquote liberals in Israel, doing that anytime soon. So these things need to all be kept in mind when we're hearing these fanciful ideas. And we're hearing about multipolar support in China and Russia and Saudi Arabia, and everybody supports. Yeah, I mean, I think we'd all like to see a two-state solution at this point compared to all the chaos we've seen. But the fact is, Israel are the ones that have effectively besieged the entire Gaza Strip and are the ones calling the shots. So it's a tough situation. But as far as other parties getting involved, we actually see Greek warships now intercepting Houthi drones. You remember they had one of their ships was always standing strong as part of Operation Prosperity Guardian, so they're getting into the action a little bit, I guess. And at the same time, I mentioned the Hezbollah strikes in Accra, but we're seeing Israel striking deeper into Lebanon on Hezbollah. And you mentioned those strikes, Dimitri, but people are like, well, we're striking Hezbollah sites. Well, look, for most of those areas, Hezbollah is just the entire society, like the shops, the hospitals, the roads, all these things are maintained and kept by quote unquote Hezbollah. So Israel has a pretty wide swath of targets, considering that Hezbollah is a military civil society entity that operates all facets of any area or territory's existence. But regarding going back to the U.S. protests, it does seem that the protests did expedite this aid. And sure, the biggest chunk of aid that was approved in these latest bills from Mike Johnson was to Ukraine. But the fact that Israel needs so much money is really kind of helping smooth out, the path for these foreign aid bills that most of the American people, I believe, are growing pretty tired of. But now that Israel is, under imminent threat, we're hearing from all these good old boy Southern Baptist representatives from Georgia and these other places about the biblical mandate to support Israel and all this other hokey garbage. So the eschatological war in the Holy Land has really come home to roost here in the United States. But Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say about, the Khan Yunis, Gaza situations, maybe the Ben Gvir thing or anything else going on in the Holy Land, I think it's about time to move into the Caucasus, which we're seeing some pretty crazy stuff going on in Armenia.
Yeah, no, I think the Khan Yunis grave, digging it up was, of course, a tragedy. And regardless of, who exactly, created the mass grave, it could have even been the local Palestinian people, of course. Mass graves and so-called brotherly graves, they do take place during times of strife and war. Such graves were created during the Russian Revolution, even after the February Revolution in cities like St. Petersburg in March of 1917. So even before the Bolsheviks came to power, there were, of course, victims of violent protesters and terrorists who were buried, I guess, all together, and they were burlesque. There was a collective funeral services, things like that. And so finding bodies in the sand of women and children, we just need to not forget that who put those bodies there, right? In a metaphysical sense, they were all slain by the Leviathan, by the power of the Zionists, essentially. So not by the Palestinians themselves. So we just have to remember who put the bodies there. The fact that they were buried without certain dignities, things like that, that's quite irrelevant. They were all killed by bombardment from the air, from tanks, and from various bombs forged, by the U.S. military-industrial complex as well as its subsidiary in Israel. But speaking of like finding more bodies in the sand, there's apparently rising tensions as we've been speaking about for the last few weeks between Azerbaijan and Armenia. There's protests in a series of Armenian cities on the border of Azerbaijan, which now allegedly Azerbaijan is proposing to take those cities over. They have already sent a 9 package of proposals from Baku actually to Yerevan in Armenia, the capital, of stating that they want to actually take over certain villages and they want them to become Azeri. Now, the local Armenian people are actually completely against this, and allegedly, Conrad Pashinyan is actually for the fact that these areas need to be seceded to Azerbaijan, which is quite interesting because he held this like really strong nationalistic position for the last 2.5 years, and suddenly he's, so to speak, sawing out a little bit and actually surrendering Armenian territories, which is maybe perhaps normal for an ally of Macron and an ally of NATO and the EU, like a Zelenskyite that he is. But it's quite curious because those sort of people also hold this false patriotism. They use it to push their people to further increase warfare with their neighbors, like what we see with Macron, Zelensky, people like that. They do have this bravado about them. So it's quite curious seeing Pashinyan for the first time almost give that away. So perhaps this will be his undoing because for the last few years he's kept the bravado up, and this is what's perhaps even kept him in power amongst the Armenian populace. His electorate has been determined by his Armenian patriotism. So of course Baku, Azerbaijan being in this dominant position, as we've stated, like they are building air bases potentially for future strikes against Iran. The world elites, right, the globalists, this alliance between NATO, Turkey, Israel, and probably the US in the background, they are banking on Azerbaijan becoming this hub of Caspian Sea power, perhaps even against a future rising Russian Empire, as well as the rebuilding of the great Shia power of Iran at the moment, sort of still rising up from the sanctions which were placed upon it 40 years ago. So now that Iran is rising, Russia is rising, they do need a sort of hub of power in the southern Caucasus. And the Georgians are too unreliable, because they're Orthodox Christians. At any point, you can't really introduce gay marriage and all these cultural liberal aspects into their culture. The Georgians could always rise up and protest. So the Christianity of Georgia really protects it, sort of insulates it and immunizes it against any sort of real strong incursions of soft power from the West. But Azerbaijan doesn't really have this issue. In fact, Azerbaijan is hyper secularized, even from an Islamic perspective. They're not that devout. Collectively speaking, I'm sure there are devout Muslims, both Shia and Sunni, living in Azerbaijan. And from an Orthodox perspective, Azerbaijan, Baku, does not have a bishop at the moment. There's an Archimandrite which has taken over, and he's very, if you think he's ethnically an Azeri, so he's definitely not going to oppose any of Aliyev's policies. And so even the Orthodox Church of Baku, which is under the Russian Patriarchate, it's not going to take a strong stance for peace, for Armenia or any country along its border. In fact, I think he'll probably play ball with whatever proposal Aliyev and the Azeri government has. So we do see Azerbaijan rising and Armenia kind of falling and dwindling before our very eyes, internally as well as externally on its borders and fringes.
Yeah, Pashinyan has been visiting the Tavish region trying to convince the people to just peacefully give up these towns to Azerbaijan and just accept it because he claims that they're under imminent threat of a Turkish invasion if they don't just give these up. And I believe some of these are exclaves only connected to mainland Armenia by road. I believe some of them also, though, may be, former exclaves of Azerbaijan in Armenia that they demand be given back to Azerbaijan. So that would be much more controversial as well. But some of the news is about the Armenian apostolic bishops and their stance. Apparently, police, they used brute force against protesters, beat them, pulled them out of their cars to try to unblock the road in the town of Kirants. And the primate of the Gugark diocese, Bishop Hovnan Hakobian, I love these Armenian names, he supported and visited these people that were arrested in prison and is standing in solidarity with them against being handed over to Azerbaijan. So, the Armenian Apostolic Church is getting in the fray. Obviously, I think they would have advised a while ago that they should maybe stick with the Russians, but as we discussed last week, the Russian peacekeepers have really left the region, which seems to show that Russia is acceding to Azerbaijan, doing what it will, which is likely in response to Armenia leaving and messing up the CSTO and courting Macron, who simultaneously was wanting to put troops on the ground in Ukraine. So I guess words and actions have consequences, which is what we're seeing here. But speaking of the Turkey situation, every episode now we've reiterated the fact that Erdogan and Aliyev and Azerbaijan, they're building this connection from the Caspian Sea to Istanbul with the Nakhchivan exclave, hoping to cleave the Zangezur corridor from the southern Armenian panhandle, the little southern section there. And we saw recently this week as well, this is from a Turkish news outlet, Turkey and Iraq signed the Development Road Agreement during President Erdogan's visit to Baghdad. The project, which will connect the Persian Gulf to Europe via Turkey, will be completed in 2028. It is expected to cost $17 billion. So we know Turkey has been part of a lot of these pseudo Belt and Road type projects. They want to be having all sorts of trade and energy routes from Central Asia, from the South and the Indian Ocean up through Turkey, making, Turkey and the Bosphorus Straits one of the primary, if not the most important connection from Asia, Eurasia, and Europe into, the West. And, you hear this on Turkish Airlines and at the airport that, Istanbul is, the crossroads of the world and all these sorts of things. They're really trying to make that a reality. But on this Baghdad trip, we saw Erdogan walking off the plane and stumbling and looking really, really old and decrepit. So again, we know 2028 is really the timeline, but any day he could go out, and we know that Erdogan in many ways is sort of, I hate to say this, people debate, is there any claim of the Ottoman Empire or the Turks to the title of the Roman Empire? And insofar as, the Roman emperor acts as a sort of restrainer against the Antichrist, we are seeing that in Erdogan right now, because we know, according to the prophecies and what's been discussed, once Erdogan goes, that's when a lot of this stuff is really going to start to unfold. So, that watermelon salesman, we may have issues with him, but he's holding some things back, and we're watching him closely. Seeing him stumble around in Iraq proves it may be, sooner rather than later, but he is still trying to spread the, Turkish world influence as wide as it can, cast the influence net of Turkey as wide as he can across the Islamic world, and assert Turkey's claim to that, kind of successor to the caliphate status that, Saudi Arabia and Iran and maybe a few other places every once in a while try to lay claim to. But the situation as a whole in the Caucasus, I believe, should be more concerning to the Russians. As we've said, I don't think it's actually a good thing that the Orthodox Church and the Russian government is turning a blind eye to the, you know, sandwiching of Armenia between these Turkic states that, again, Turkey, they've been doing some work against Israel. They've embargoed many Israeli goods. They're really going after a meeting with Hamas, all these sorts of things, whereas Azerbaijan is still totally in the pocket of Israel. We know Turkey, you mentioned the secular reality of these countries. Turkey is pretty secular, but they still have political Islam. I don't think Azerbaijan has even that much, because if there was that much, politically motivated Islamic, activity in that country, I doubt they would stand for how that country relates to Israel, because in every other Islamic country, they protest in the streets because their country aren't bombing Israel, let alone giving them free energy and allowing them to perhaps use their military bases. I mean, that's absurd. So the Caucasus situation is fascinating. The U.S., at any moment, of course, could get involved. We've seen their involvement in Georgia as the situation there heats up with the foreign agents law. They're really trying to keep Georgia in the EU Western sphere of influence, whereas the Georgian people are really trying to carve their own way, but it's really almost not possible. Anything that would even appear to look like sovereignty will be called being in the Russian sphere of influence and being a quote unquote Russian puppet state. So we hope the Georgians can resist all of that. But Dmitry, unless you have anything else from the Caucasus, it's probably time to start talking about Russia and the situation going on along the front lines in Ukraine.
Yeah, of course, some major developments on the Russian angle. Naturally, we've seen Russia advance in the Zaporozhye region very slowly. We're talking like 1 kilometer per week type advancements forward. Of course, Russia has the advantage of the Surovikin line, which General Surovikin did construct, still stands strong. So of course, Russia does have all those defensive formations in the Zaporozhye Oblast of the SMO zone to rely upon in case if it ever needs to fall back and actually protect itself. But there is that, of course, growing escalation. Does Russia, prior to mobilization or even without a mobilization, we discussed that last week quite in depth, does it actually go forward and conquer even larger swaths of territory? For example, the other, say, third of the Zaporozhye Oblast, Russia already controls 2/3, or even the Kherson Oblast, does it actually cross the Dnieper, which would be like an amphibian type of operation? Again, a lot more difficult to expand towards Kherson and Nikolaev, and of course Odessa would, essentially be like an SMO 2.0 in terms of scale. But of course, Russia is advancing towards the entirety of Donetsk. It's pushing way past Bakhmut at this point, and Avdiivka, Ukraine's fortress cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk sort of are the next two big barriers standing before cities such as Izium later on, which Russia abandoned in late 2022. And of course, we're seeing kind of the outcomes of that. At the end of the episode, we will discuss church persecutions in Ukraine and how they're exactly heating up. But these regions are all very full of Orthodox Christians, monasteries, churches, which, as Russia is taking over some of the territory, veneration and worship is actually restarting in full. People can actually go to church again. They can pray for their patriarch, who's Patriarch Kirill. They can even pray for Metropolitan Onufry. They could read Russian books. They can sing in Russian. They can do things which they've done for hundreds of years without being harassed. So this is like a big deal. So and every time Russia advances forward, we have to see it not just as a military victory; it's also a victory for Christianity. And I'm saying this not with some pathos or some weird exaltation. It's actually the reality on the ground. So under Ukrainian rule, these territories in Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk, as we know, is already mostly Russian anyway, like 95+%. But in even Kharkov, once these territories are liberated, of course, peace and prosperity will, of course, eventually take place. And even if not economic prosperity, which eventually will, of course, take place with rebuilding, as we've seen in Mariupol, which a city which was besieged early on during the SMO was completely reconstructed and now is thriving, sort of on the coast of the Azov Sea. We'll see that prosperity follow whatever spiritual and cultural positivity takes place in those regions. But one of the most interesting developments, Conrad, was the technological advancements we've seen from the Russian side, if you can even call it that. Perhaps it's going back in time to World War One era. We've seen Russian tanks advancing down these roads. These roads, of course, are heavily mined. You can't really even stray off the path because there's mines all over the field. Zaporozhye, as a territory, never even had defensive lines. If you think about it, this is the steppes. These are like fields. Think about it in Game of Thrones type terms, or like in Lord of the Rings. This is the plains of Rohan or some Dothraki plains. You cannot build any defensive formations here. It's just plains of fields, and they can only be defended by mines. So you do need to advance with armor. But how do you advance with tanks and armored vehicles which protect your troops from the mines or even from imminent death? Because if troops get hit, if a mine explodes near a person, the person will surely die from the shrapnel and the explosion itself. But in armored vehicles, there is some form of defense. But the Ukrainians have been using their cheap drones to either suicide ram them into these armored tanks or even drop bombs onto the tanks themselves. And that's been quite a sticking point. Russians haven't been able to develop an alternative to how to move through these particular points. But now they've learned how to put a tin shed, right? This is the new development. The tin shed on top of the tank method. So the tank is dressed in an extra layer of armor, essentially, on the outside. It even has its own makeshift hatch, which makes me think that these were created not in some shed like in Zaporozhye or Donetsk, but they were actually made in factory. These are factory-grade tin sheds. They're probably not aluminium, right? These are proper steel defenses, which would essentially make the tanks look very, like something out of Attack on Titan or something. They just look very bizarre and strange. But they do protect from the drone explosions. Like the drone explosions are mitigated by a sizable percentage. We've seen the drones, actually suicide drones, a lot of which are actually AI sort of controlled. So in fact, when they do see a target, they automatically fly in and attack. And we've seen the shed actually withstand all the attack, and the tank with the shed shell on top of it, like a turtle, moves forward and just ignores all the drone attacks. So that's quite interesting. Perhaps this will be sort of implemented en masse, and we'll see these extra armored tanks kind of moving forward. And the interesting story is, Conrad, we've all heard news about how the Abrams tank, the US has asked Ukraine not to utilize the Abrams tanks, which it has gifted Ukraine, in any new offensives. They should be kept on the back end as sort of plan B and plan C defenses, because as we've seen, tanks in this particular combat in the SMO zone, they're great tools, but they really shouldn't be overutilized because, again, drones, mines, these things really disrupt any sort of advancement from them. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are on the new tank shed, but I think, anything that protects Christian people from being destroyed by these AI, robotic, Terminator type technologies, I think that's probably a good thing moving forward. I think these are positive developments. And as I said, the further Russia moves into these Ukrainian territories, the more beneficial it is for the Ukrainians themselves from a cultural and religious perspective.
Well, ever since the drones have been introduced, I think we actually saw the Ukrainians develop some kind of, I think they were calling them like cope cages for the above, the hatch, where the drones could just blast through the hatch and just kill the person immediately inside the tank. That was kind of the immediate issue. And then the drones became more powerful and were able to disable the tanks overall. And we're seeing now the Russians, I believe it's an entire package and sort of like an expansion, like DLC for the tanks on the front line. They're sending to everybody these tin sheds, like you said, that you send them, they're quickly installed on all of the hardware, and they're good to go. But yeah, that's the war. I mean, the drone warfare is really the main innovation we've seen throughout these wars, and we're seeing it now in Israel, Iran, as we saw Iran send 150 plus drones from its own territory all the way over 1,600 plus kilometers over to Israel. So very interesting times indeed. But as far as the front line, you know, advancements and development goes, we saw a precision strike take down the largest television tower in Kharkov, which was used by both military and civilian broadcast centers. Very striking image as it just was toppled by a immediate blast. And we also, of course, saw a very interesting story. I don't think we have 100% confirmation, but in the village of Ocheretinye, the Russian flag was raised after just 3 days of them reaching the borders. It seems that the Ukrainian forces withdrew extremely quickly. I think some said even against orders. Of course, they're claiming to be mounting a counterattack because this is deep, deep, deep into Ukrainian territory. Like, this is not like, if you think about a map, this is not, on just a little jut out from a big front line. This is a huge incursion along a highway and along some roads into territory they're completely surrounded by the Ukrainians at this point. But it appears that certain collapses, if you could call them that, are occurring on the infantry level across the Ukrainian front line as, again, the average age is getting higher and higher, the equipment is getting crummier and crummier, and the Russians are just mercilessly advancing as we said with these turtle cage things, they adapt and overcome. And we're seeing as well, Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts. We've heard news of the gathering of the new North group. They aren't writing Z or V or O, they're writing N on all of their tanks and people. So, we know who to really support now. These are the real guys, these are the people that are gonna, say it with their chest. But of course, that Ukraine is Russia, right? But they're gathering on the border with Kharkov and Sumy oblasts, and of course, like we said, with the precision strike on the broadcast tower, it's extremely obvious that Russia is going to make a move on Kharkov, and everybody is just waiting for that at this point. Syrskyi, half of his statements just read like black-pilled acceptances of inevitable retreats and withdrawals from certain villages. So, Dmitry, I'm wondering your thoughts. We, of course, also hear that Moldova claims that if Russia advances towards Nikolaev and Odessa, they will, within 24 hours, be able to rejoin and reconnect with Romania, while at the same time claiming they want to arrest the president of Gagauzia, who has said that they will join Russia if such a reunification between Moldova and Romania occurs. So I'm wondering your thoughts on the impending advances and what our current situation and the signs that we have now indicate about the next 2, 3, 4 months.
I would actually pay a lot of attention to Syrskyi's statements, not just because he's the main leader and the commander of the Ukrainian forces, but because we've seen Ukraine before with their weird patriotic bravado kind of pushing the Ukrainians forward. If Syrskyi in his statements is anticipating a retreat, perhaps he's morally preparing his own troops, those on the front lines who do watch his clips and statements and his secular type sermons, and perhaps they would then sort of see the future retreats from even, let's just say, half of the Kharkovsky Oblast, if Ukraine does leave it and does leave their frontline defenses there open to say, Russian liberation, perhaps that will kind of prepare them morally for it. And, just this major Ukrainian aid bill that the US passed recently, I think that's primarily to bolster Ukrainian morale, which has been collapsing recently. So I'm not surprised that certain, say, even some of the more nationalistic groups who perhaps they're not really keen on even Talmudic control of their own forces because these people are so-called white supremacists and whatnot, these Banderite figures, the fact that they're retreating does kind of, there is some indication that they're retreating. It does kind of inform us that, yeah, perhaps morale really doesn't go that far when you have people like Syrskyi, who is, I guess, an ethnically Russian, so technically an orc, according to Ukrainian secular weird Banderite theology, and Zelensky, who is Jewish. It doesn't really somehow bolster morale on that particular end. So how will that $60 billion be utilized for Ukraine's benefit? And will this 60 billion actually go towards any sort of defenses, or will it be used for offensive action? How will it be distributed? I think these questions will be answered in the next few weeks. As we're moving towards the alleged the cancelled election, right, of May of this year, which I think is a huge deal. Perhaps legitimacy around the 9th of May parade in Russia. Maybe Putin will openly announce that Zelensky is an illegitimate president, because at this point Zelensky has been the main person with whom Russia tried to at least have peace talks with. So they have seen Zelensky as a legitimate elected person at this point, even before the SMO began. And this was one of the issues with Poroshenko when Russia completely, took Poroshenko on board as the president of Ukraine, legally and lawfully elected. This was one of the reasons why the entire Novorossiya project essentially fell through, and Donetsk and Lugansk had to suffer for the next 8 years, was because Russia began negotiating with Poroshenko as a legitimate figure of authority. in the Ukrainian rudder. But speaking of Transnistria, those sort of areas, Gagauzia, Russian soft power in Gagauzia has been very interestingly utilized. Of course, those people remember the Soviet Union, they remember prosperity, which modern Moldova, of course, doesn't have. And so Russia is simply looking to exploit those feelings, as it should have, of course, years ago, I would say. And Moldova simply cannot react, right? It has its close ally, a member of NATO, Romania, and it does seek to perhaps even give up its sovereignty, I would say, in order to sort of maybe even throw off this Russian soft power incursions into its own territory. Of course, if I was the Russian president, I would also utilize any sort of separatist attitudes within Moldova itself in terms of Gagauzien identity. I would probably exploit that in terms of pushing it as a soft power move against Moldova, which Moldova now closely aligns with the West, unquestionably. And we're not speaking about the West as a conservative Christian identity. No, this is the new liberal, capitalistic, degenerate West, which Moldova really wants to become a part of. Not the actual conservative Moldovan people, but the government, the elites of the country. We do seek their they are seeking to join that particular Leviathan in their sort of future cruise through the oceans of worldly affairs. So I'm not surprised that Moldovan politicians are moving towards this union or this emergency union with Romania, because as we've spoken before, in order to get to Transnistria, Russian troops would need to pass through Moldova itself. So Moldovan sovereignty would need to be breached by Russia, even if temporarily, even as a point of transit. Chisinau itself does not need to be taken by Russian troops, but to get to Transnistria, to save it from Ukrainian incursion, which is always, of course, there is always a risk of that, it would need to go through the Odessa Oblast and into Moldova itself. So Moldovans understand this. They understand their alleged sovereignty is at threat, and they're preparing for it, even making these open statements. Mind you, these open statements are similar to how different reptilian creatures, of course, like chameleons and other toads, sort of give off bright colors in order to scare predators away. These statements are essentially saying, Russia, do not attack us. You massive beast. We're poisonous. But in fact, I think the threats are a little bit tamer here. If Romania ever wanted to annex or join with Moldova, they would have done so long ago, I think, as we've seen Finland join NATO and other countries. I think Romania understands the threat to its own national sovereignty from Russia, and so it probably won't even take the bait and probably won't be involved in this Moldovan scandal taking place over there. So I think the ball is in Russia's court moving into the summer. I think Russia's on the front lines. Regardless of how the $60 billion is distributed, we've seen hundreds of billions already wasted on Ukrainian armored power. We've seen the failed offensive of 2023 in the summer of that year, and we've seen even the planes given to Ukraine, of course, not really even dent the Russian defenses at all. So speaking positively, right, taking aside Russian domestic affairs, externally speaking, Russia is standing very, very strongly on pushing forward into some of these regions. And so whenever it does choose to have a Kherson, Nikolaev, Odessa offensive, I think it'll have all of the inside folks on their own side. For example, Gagazians, Transnistrians, those people will in fact be on the Russian side, and they will accept Russian tanks, and they'll accept the Russian liberation of open arms. I think that's something that has been planned, and those seeds have been planted at least a few months ago. Perhaps this was even the, when the Russian troops entered into Ukraine and at the beginning of the SMO, perhaps these were some of the guarantees that were falsely given to Russia, which in fact did not come to pass. So Russia does need to understand that the failure of the SMO in the early months, they do need to heed that lesson and perhaps go into some of these new regions in future months with a lot more caution.
You mentioned the $60 billion. Of course, we saw that big aid package. It was 60 billion plus to Ukraine, 25, 30, not something billion to Israel, and then 8 billion to Taiwan. And then just today, of course, we saw another emergency $6 billion from the Defense Department approved by Lloyd Austin. I guess that's just getting tacked on there as well. Not sure where all the money's coming from, but it seems that they're really throwing it all in on this last ditch effort. I assume they're going all in on this last ditch effort, which is, I assume, a sort of attempt to preserve the current territorial gains of Russia where they are and somehow force negotiations on that level. But I think that ship is already sailed. The Russians are going to be taking more territory, and they are just waiting for perhaps these dates in May, whenever it is, or awaiting a future partial mobilization again to boost up their ranks, to really advance all the way across the front line, perhaps cross the Dnieper River into Kherson, and ultimately push, like Dmitry was talking about, towards Nikolaev, Odessa, and ultimately Moldova, and to perhaps help liberate Gagauzia and Pridnestrovia as well. So all of these things are really coming into play, and we're keeping up with all of them. Again, while Ukraine makes up the largest amount of the aid bill, and they're the largest recipient currently, it's important to know that Israel is the region that it was actually able to move forward to begin with. Because before Israel came into the picture, the Republicans were coming out pretty strongly against Ukraine aid, and shockingly, I believe it was 21 Republicans voted against Israel aid, which is a stunning development. It shows how rapidly and far the Overton window has shifted, even within Republican and right wing politics, on the issue of support for Israel and their occupation of the American government and their control of our foreign policy. So, very interesting to see all of the Freedom Caucus, right wing quote unquote members of Congress. They were willing to stand against it, including my own congressman, Chip Roy. So, interesting to see. But, Dmitry, I'm wondering your thoughts on the situation with Timur Ivanov and his arrest. We gotta start getting through some of these things, but between him and Strelkov, there's been some interesting developments in the Russo sphere, to say the least.
Yeah, this is probably the biggest arrest we've seen since the arrest of Strelkov himself, and perhaps even the temporary sort of shutting down of Yevgeny Prigozhin, right after the 24th of June last year, where he was reprimanded. There was an investigation case open. So, to begin, the Deputy Minister of Defense, so this is a bureaucratic public servant position. He's not a member of the military at all. Timur Ivanov, the right-hand man of the Minister of Defense himself, Sergei Shoigu, one of the most powerful bureaucratic positions in the Russian Federation today, because essentially he was in charge of everything in the Russian military industrial complex that had to do with civilian buildings, catering, food, nutrition for the army, dress, forestry, etc., even land, real estate matters. And he was, in fact, responsible, this Timur Ivanov fellow who was recently arrested by the Russian government. The investigation is still ongoing, so we don't have any conclusions, but he was charged with corruption. I think it was tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of US dollars, which doesn't seem like much, but you only need so much of a pretext in order to arrest a public servant. There shouldn't be, if you're a public servant, you really shouldn't be taking bribes and things like that. But we do know how some of these countries in Eastern Europe really work. Ukraine is, of course, the best example, receiving billions of dollars and things just disappearing in offshore accounts. And, we know that these things take place in Russia as well. But Timur Ivanov is probably the leading, this guy knows all kinds of secrets, right? Consider this. So, consider the fact that he was the man responsible, actually, for constructing the Patriot Park. This is the park surrounding the military Russian cathedral, recently constructed just west of Moscow in the Moscow Oblast, the giant military arms cathedral. That park, including, of course, the inclusion of Hitler's personal visor cap, it was Timur Ivanov's idea. So he, of course, built the entire World War II Russian victory over Nazism museum in the first place. He was a major, I would say, a major administrator. He had a real sort of skill similar to Yevgeny Prigozhin in constructing various projects for the military-industrial complex of Russia for several years now, since 2016, actually. So he's been in his position for 8 long years. He's also a very curious figure because, again, like most Russian bureaucrats and politicians, we can list an entire slew of them. He was a pure-blooded noviop. And what does noviop mean? Well, noviop essentially means a new social person in the Russian Federation. So noviops are typically Russian bureaucrats. This term was invented by Dmitry Golkovsky, who you may have seen the episode about him on Russians of Attitude. Dmitry Golkovsky said that noviops are essentially new historical community members, usually tied in with the Jewish elites of Russia. These are people who emerged after the 1990s, and bureaucrats and politicians in Russia who actually are closely tied in with business and commercial capitalist affairs, who now make up the large percentage of the Russian elite. So Timur Ivanov is a typical noviop. Why? Because his wife, of course, is a citizen of Israel. She's Jewish. Her name is Irene. And coincidentally, after the beginning of the SMO, Timur Ivanov and Irene divorced. Now, we don't like getting into, say, family affairs, Conrad. It's not really we're not TMZ or something like that. We don't report on scandalous behaviors. We don't report on, say, why did Putin divorce his wife in 2013? These sort of questions don't interest us too much, but this has a direct impact on geopolitics because his children are citizens of Israel by birth, and they do have dual citizenship with Russia and Israel. Just very curious that the right-hand man of the Russian military in its bureaucratic sort of iteration has ties to Israel, direct ties. This apparently had nothing to do with his arrest, but moving forward, a lot of Russian citizens, a lot of people in powerful positions, journalists, politicians, they do have ties to Israel. Even the Prime Minister Dmitry Mishustin, of course, he's half Jewish, half Armenian. So We're not even going to get into those particular details. And we spoke about Surovikin, how his mother, his wife are Jewish. But Ivanov specifically, how capable is this guy? Could he really be the corrupt person that we've spoken about? Well, in fact, he definitely has been flaunting his lifestyle. His wife's Instagram channel has a lot of really curious photos. He's dressing up in like the best formal outfits. Sometimes in some of those outfits, he's dressing up as a king. He's dressing up as this aristocrat traveling around Europe. Forbes gave him a net worth of around $2 million US dollars, or $1.5 million US dollars, which again is a little bit high for a Russian bureaucrat simply working off his salary when he's not allowed to take bribes and things like that, not allowed to make certain investments. Maybe he purchased Bitcoin early on in his history. That's how he acquired such a large net worth. But him being investigated also ties directly to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Do you recall, Conrad, when Prigozhin had those sort of gripes with Shoigu? He said certain things weren't delivered on time, especially missiles, armaments. Well, Timur Ivanov was in charge of some of those things, being Shoigu's right-hand man, the executioner of a lot of Shoigu's plans. And Prigozhin himself directly went to Russia, began that whole 24th of June on Shabbat drive towards Moscow because of Shoigu. Prigozhin wasn't aiming for Putin or Medvedev or anyone else. It was directly aimed at Shoigu. Perhaps it was aimed at Ivanov himself. So it really ties it off. So we've seen figures like Shoigu leave the scene. We've seen people like Surovikin leave, and now Timur Ivanov is going as well. The downside is, of course, that he was definitely a capable administrator. During the COVID pandemic, the Russian military was very much frozen. There were a lot of people didn't know what to do in terms of people were getting sick. No one was really coming to work, but he kept the Russian civilian administrative machine moving. And so despite COVID, he kept preparing the Russian military for essentially what we'd see later on during the SMO itself. So perhaps even the failures and successes could be partially given to him, I suppose, as his personal accolades. Now, what's the other curious thing is he was responsible partially, not just for Patriot Park, but the rebuilding of Mariupol on the coast of the Azov Sea. He personally organized some of those projects. He's the guy who organized the North Korean workers, the labor folks, to come over into Mariupol to rebuild it. And the idea of bringing North Korean laborers to rebuild a broken Russian city is probably not the worst idea on earth. So we can't really say that this guy is some sort of negative figure. Now, what's curious, of course, is the fact that his arrest coincides with the alleged rumors of Strelkov's release and his sort of army unit being prepared for Strelkov in the Donetsk People's Republic, and a small battalion of volunteers who Strelkov will lead into, I suppose, as a free man, sort of a military commander, once he leaves prison. Apparently a contract is being drafted. And again, this is just a rumor that Strelkov will be released from prison. Of course, this is great news for us. This rumor was openly stated by his good friend, Rustem Amaleyev. And Rustem Amaleyev is not just a random guy with a Islamic name. He's the head leader of the National Congress of Tatars of Moscow. So he's a very famous, popular Tatar figure in the Tatar community. It's the second largest ethnicity in Russia. Strelkov personally appeared on his YouTube channel several times. So we'll see kind of Strelkov possibly released later in the next few weeks, and maybe even being on the front lines alongside Gabriel Doroshin and some of these other really powerful, moralizing figures who will boost Russia's confidence, I would say the confidence of the troops. And this is, I think, probably the best news we've received this week in terms of, well, the Russian state perhaps moving forward, not just arresting a corrupt, man who's married to Israeli citizens or, was married to an Israeli citizen, but also the release of Strelkov. It's quite bolstering for the morale, Conrad. I'm not sure if there's anything negative about these particular news, and perhaps it's a strike of the higher powers in Russia against the fifth column. Perhaps this is a move against Shoigu himself. And we've mentioned how Shoigu does have very mysterious roots himself. Shoigu's grandfather's name was Jacob Rivlin. Recall the last name coincides with the last name of the 10th president of Israel, Reuben Rivlin. So Shoigu may also have some of these Levantine roots in particular. So perhaps these sort of connections are being exploited by the Russian elites. Maybe they're looking for people with dual loyalties, and they're kind of clamping down on any sort of traces of betrayal. So I would say very positive developments domestically in Russia, like not just externally in Ukraine, but at home as well. Now, of course, during our military segment about Ukraine and Russia, we spoke about the fact that as Russia advances, especially in the Donetsk Oblast, Russian and Ukrainian people are freed. They're freed from persecution. The biggest example of this, and this is perhaps the most, besides what's happening in the Middle East, this is the most negative news, quite apocalyptically speaking, significant given the week and given the fact that Christ himself goes on trial before the Sanhedrin next week. We have our own modern Sanhedrin taking place in this capital of New Jerusalem in the city of Dnipropetrovsk of Ukraine. This is, of course, the city which is run by the former leader of the Azov Battalion, Kolomoisky, as well as with the Rose Synagogue and giant Jewish community center. And probably the biggest synagogue in all of Europe is actually located there. Metropolitan Arsenius of the Svyatogorsk Monastery. So this is the monastery represented on our A4 background photograph, a beautiful white monastery located on a place called the Holy Mountain in the Donetsk Oblast, currently occupied by the Ukrainian forces. Metropolitan Arsenius, who's the caretaker and the leader of this monastery, was arrested by Ukrainian federal agents, the SBU, and taken to the city of Slavyansk, right? So this is the former city which Strelkov held. Now it's, of course, a Ukrainian military fortress city, essentially. And in Slavyansk, he was given a sentence which was carried essentially on the papers behind closed doors, given to him from the Dnipro criminal courts. They sentenced Metropolitan Arsenius to 2 months of prison, no bail, no parole, nothing. Just awaiting future hearings and trials. Allegedly for what? What did Metropolitan Arsenius do? He lived in his monastery quietly. Well, apparently he gave a sermon a couple of months ago in which he complained that Ukrainian military was blocking the roads for pilgrims who were traveling to the monastery. Mind you, the monastery it's a real monastery in the Donetsk Oblast, as in it's located on a mountain near a river, essentially in the countryside. So there is like 1 or 2 roads which lead there, and that's it. And Ukrainian military set up block posts on that road, and the Metropolitan simply mentioned that those block posts were located there. It's like, well, there's 3 block posts on the road, and this is a clear sign that the Ukrainian state is trying to stop from Orthodox pilgrims, trying to harass them and search their cars and search their personal belongings while they're trying to come to liturgy and things like that. As you can imagine, these are real concerns, something that Metropolitan has a right to speak about. Allegedly, him mentioning those blog posts was revealing this information to the Russian state and the Russian military. So he was spying for the Russians. So this is his offense. And now he is, of course, Metropolitan Arsenius will be in prison for 2 months. Unfortunately, we're seeing mixed reactions from his own Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The Metropolitan of Sumy Yevlogius actually gave a very lukewarm answer to this. Metropolitan Yevlogi himself was persecuted, and his own diocese had many churches raided by Ukrainian Banderite neo-Nazis. And Metropolitan Yevlogi said the following. He said, "My sincere hope is that the criminal investigation regarding Metropolitan Arseni will be impartial and fair." Is that the only comment you can give, my fair bishop? How about the fact that the criminal investigation is baseless, and the fact that this is a clear persecution of an Orthodox hierarch? Does anybody want to bring that factor up? No. And even the most popular deacon in all of Ukraine, Andrei Palchuk, who is very popular in Ukrainian Telegram and popular in Ukrainian TikTok and releases clips. He's from Odessa himself. He does have very pro-Ukrainian attitudes, but he said, "Oh, this is above my pay grade. This is something the Ukrainian Synod needs to discuss and something that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church officials need to discuss." I'm sorry, but if a bishop is being persecuted in the open and we can see it on camera, we can see him being sentenced, this is a public concern, I think, for all Ukrainians, because if Ukraine, the state itself, continues to persecute Orthodox Christian hierarchs, the Lord's judgment, the Lord will punish the country even more than it has been punished already in order to bring it to its senses. I think this is a moral quandary for all Ukrainian citizens. They need to consider, well, why is that state bringing Orthodox bishop into criminal court? Why are they being sentenced? Why are they being sent to prisons with rapists, murderers, and pedophiles and people like that? Being put into some of these cells alongside some of these weird other criminal elements. Like, this is incredibly disrespectful. We've not really seen this since the Soviet persecution of Orthodox clergy, so it is very striking. So again, big prayers for Metropolitan Arsenius as the sort of persecutions continue. Meanwhile, we have mentioned Metropolitan Longin in western Ukraine. He was again harassed recently. He's literally recovering from a heart attack, and he was stopped at a Ukrainian checkpoint, and his car and his personal belongings were searched for 2 hours. And this is a Metropolitan who was recovering from a heart attack. He just had heart surgery. He's been beaten up. We've seen his church raided several times. He's probably the most persecuted Metropolitan in all of Ukraine, frankly, maybe only after Jonathan, who's still sitting in prison at the moment. And with the significance of Svyatogorsk Monastery, let's not play it down. It is the 3rd largest monastery in all of Ukraine, after the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra and the Pskov-Pechersk Lavra in western Ukraine. So Svyatogorsk Lavra of Donetsk is currently without its leader. Its leader is sitting in a Ukrainian prison cell. This is a clear strike against Orthodox Christianity, one of many. And notice the timing. He won't be celebrating Palm Sunday service with us. He won't be celebrating perhaps even the Easter service. He'll be in prison. So this is a strike against the morality and the Christian conscience of Ukrainians as well as the local Russian people, I think. It's not really a real criminal trial. It's an open persecution of Christianity that's taking place in Ukraine.
That is unfortunately reality, but speaking of, sort of desacralization and the encroaching tide of anti-religious, secular, anti-civilizational attitudes, it appears that the fake nation of Kosovo is about to become the first Muslim majority, I guess we'll say territory or area to legalize same-sex unions. Albin Kurti has been saying this, and I didn't think that it would be a Muslim country that would be the first to follow in Greece's footsteps, but it appears to be more of a Balkan trend, perhaps, than an Orthodox trend, which is, I guess, relieving to us, but very interesting. Kosovo, they're really trying to go for their liberal globalist bona fides there, but I don't know how that's going to go over. I don't know if there's going to be protests. I don't know if this is going to allow Serbia to have more influence there, perhaps. But it appears that, in many ways, the Serbia Kosovo thing is it blows very hot and very cold because we see Kosovo moving closer and closer to the Council of Europe, which we talked about last week. But we also see Serbia now collecting millions of dollars in aid from the EU and their new Western Balkans, infrastructure and rebuilding projects. So Serbia is still trying to get on that EU path, and we see the Srpska issue always remaining a little bit hotter than the Kosovo stuff because Christian Schmidt insists on moving forward with the election legislation and these other things that Dodik has insisted will not ever be enforced or go into law in Srpska. So there's much more of an impasse there. But as far as, I guess you could call Serbia somewhat of the Russo sphere of influence, we have seen U.S. troops now leaving the African countries of Chad and Niger, which is good to see. I guess Niger, they had their, them in Burkina Faso, they had their coups a while back, and they have expelled French influence and have been operating with the protection and help of, I guess the new post-Wagner operators in the Russian military operating overseas. And we saw Chad, they had a coup, and it was unclear which direction the people were going. And it seems now that the US and France and these Western influences have been largely entirely driven out of the Sahel region. And these are places with large amounts of uranium and all sorts of other natural resources, as well as containing really strategic just locations between the Sahara Desert and sub-Saharan Africa and then the Mediterranean Sea, Chad being a critical, navigation point and moving point for sub-Saharan Africans trying to make it to Libya to then make it on those boats over to Europe, which we know for many years Gaddafi was protecting Europe from. But really quick, Dimitri, before we start to wrap this thing up, maybe talk about some of these Tajiks what's going on in Russia with all of that, and then any other thoughts you may have on all the fronts we've discussed.
Right. So it seems like, we spoke about how the Russian minister against corruption, who closely works with the Russian immigration industry, and he's kind of like in between Russian immigration and he works with the Russian police internal affairs department. He's actually probably the strongest mass immigration, anti illegal immigrant advocate in all of Russia because he's openly gave borderline racist statements against some of these Central Asian immigrants. But he what's taken place recently, right, on the Kazakhstan-Russian border, and just geographically speaking, if you're not aware, the majority of the major Russian cities, especially those with million people type populations and hundreds of thousands, these large cities like Yekaterinburg, Novosibirsk, these large Russian cities, geographically speaking, along the Kazakhstan border, are all located very close to Kazakhstan and Central Asia itself. They're not deep north in Siberia because they were historically built along the rivers and in areas which were not tundrous and not exactly which were quite easy to access. And also the Trans-Siberian Railway, which was built in the 19th century, kind of gave life to those particular areas. So most of the major cities in Russia are actually located quite close to Kazakhstan's borders, which equally means that Kazakhstan's border security is vitally important for not allowing, say, drug trade, human smuggling, arms smuggling, and general criminality to get across from Central Asia, from countries like Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, and even Tajikistan into Russia, right? It all depends on Kazakhstan's police and border security forces as well as those of Russia. It's a sort of joint binary deal here. And what we've seen recently, funny enough, is hundreds and I would say maybe even close to thousands, like not tens of thousands like we see on the Mexican-US border, but Tajiks, men of working age, stopped at the Russian-Kazakhstan border and essentially not allowed to cross without proper background checks, which seems normal, right? They were all stopped at the Russian checkpoints in Kazakhstan, which again, a lot of them do pass through these checkpoints illegally and even get around the checkpoints because we're talking about hundreds of kilometers of essentially untamed land and steppes and forests. Some of these people simply illegally get across the border into Russia, but Russians are actually cracking down on border security, similar to how in the US, under the Trump administration, Trump really wanted to build that wall to protect American citizens from the negative elements coming out of Mexico. Here, Russia's doing the same. But what was Tajikistan's reaction? Notice that Tajikistan itself did not even apologize or send condolences for what those terrorists, and of course, those terrorists were Mossad, Turkey affiliated, etc., Israel affiliated, possibly, and of course, paid by Ukraine directly, which Ukraine is run by the Chabad, so we know where the sort of roots of the terrorism comes from. But they were Tajik citizens. And so the country of Tajikistan did not even send its condolences to Russia after the Crocus City Hall accident. So even typical polite diplomacy was not utilized here. And now the Tajikistan president has called the ambassador of Russia to his office in order to speak to him personally about the offenses against Tajik citizens and Tajik laborers on the border. I mean, we've spoken about this before, Conrad, but it's very clear that Kazakhstan and Russia, this border control issue, it's going to be Russia's version of Mexico. It is that inflow of heroin, opiate drugs, etc., all these destructive elements which have been polluting Russian society since, I would say, even Soviet times, since the 1980s. And this will, of course, tie in closely with Russian relations with Central Asia and how Russia can build a strong country with a strong border, absent of any mass Islamic illegal immigration, as well as even legally, like this. We've spoken about the replacement of Europeans principle. The capitalists in Russia, these massive oligarchs, these people related to Israel, marrying Jewish wives, having Jewish parents, grandparents, these people don't really care about the ethnic makeup of like the local Russian peoples, including the majority Russian ethnic people makeup. This is potentially there's an operation for human replacement taking place in Russia itself. Behind the scenes, a lot of Russian nationalists have been talking about this. Mass immigration into Russia is just as big of an issue. And we're not speaking about Chechens and Dagestanis. These are Central Asians, completely unrelated to anything Russian, in fact. So these people are coming into Russia. They're coming here to stay. They're taking up major portions of these cities, living on the outskirts. A lot of the crime in these areas, like if Russia had FBI crime stats, I'm sure you'd see very large percentages of them, of course, going towards some of these new members of the Russian community. So the fact that Russia's controlling its borders, I think, is incredibly admirable, and that Tajikistan is its overreaction to this, I think, is very telling. Again, it's always like as they strike you, they cry out, and I wouldn't be surprised as to who the rich oligarchs in Tajikistan are or which countries they're related to. Frankly, this is just Russia standing strong and Russia actually reacting to a clear issue. When you see the Patriarch Kirill speak about mass immigration and how it potentially is threatening to Russia's culture and its people, this is what he's speaking about here, this mass immigration of men, military-aged men, into Russian country, allegedly to work, but also to perhaps start their own families here, move their families, and essentially obtain Russian citizenship. It's incredibly dangerous. And who needs, I mean, let's just take Timur Ivanov's example. Who needs Central Asian laborers? You can always bring around North Koreans who are East Asian, they have high IQ, better work ethic, and they're also respectful. You'll never hear of North Korean raping anyone, or even respect or disrespecting women. These people are perhaps the most civilized East Asian peoples on the planet. So let's just have solutions and not bring around some of these repeated mistakes from Central Asia, because again, human elements, human criminality is very common in those particular places. Russia should disassociate itself from such aspects of bad immigration policy.
I totally agree. It's kind of a two-pronged fork. You've got the Eurasian, open border issue replacing the ethnic Slavic Orthodox people from that angle. And then we see this story from Ukraine. In Western Ukraine, there's apparently plans to rename more than 340 settlements. These bills have been put forward in the Rada, and in particular the Odessa region. It's proposed to rename the village of Nadezhdivka to Champagne, the city of Yuzhny to Port Anental, and the village of Roshka to New Paris. So on the one hand, you've got, the brown replacement, and then on this side, you've got the pure westernization, to where it's not even like that's not even a euphemism or sort of it's not of a deeper understanding of westernization. It's like, nope, this town is now called Paris. Like, it's just ridiculous. So I mean, obviously there's that town called New York, so we got all the headlines that was like New York has fallen at the beginning of the special military operation. I think we all remember that. But yeah, with all of that, I think stateside, we talked about the protests. Of course, the Trump situation is heating up. He's in trial for all of these things. The presidential immunity thing is going before the Supreme Court, which is interesting. We'll probably be posting a bit about that because it is a pretty core issue of American sovereignty and American law being sort of adjudicated before our very eyes. It's kind of funny how quickly things can get foundational when it comes to Supreme Court and all the context of this insurrection nonsense and the power of the president in light of the fact that every institution would rather just do everything against Trump, arrest him, execute him, who knows, whatever. But the reality is he was still a United States president, so they have to set precedent because, Obama, Bill Clinton, these people are still alive. So if they really go after Trump in a certain way, people may go after them too, and they probably wouldn't like that. So all of these things are on the table as the election appears to still be favoring Trump. He's leading in all the polls. He does every once in a while come out in support of the Jews and Zionists and against, these protesters and everything. So he shouldn't do that too much lest he begin to push some of those people back towards Biden because they are very disenfranchised because he's the one that they associate with the Gaza genocide. So if Trump can keep that perception up, he is going to benefit very much from that in polls, mostly due to stifled turnout and low energy from the other side so that their base will not come out while the Trump base is, of course, energized against the terrible economy and any other host of nonsense you could point out going on in the United States right now. But the only other thing I really had to talk about was the fact that we got Palm Sunday coming up, and the Holy Land. We always talk about the Rokor Church on the Mount of Olives, St. Mary Magdalene, which of course has monastics attached to it. And in honor of Palm Sunday, everybody should be aware if you ever have any plans to visit the Holy Land, you should be sure to pay a visit to the grave of the donkey that carried Christ into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He is buried at St. Mary Magdalene's Orthodox Church there, the beautiful golden domed church on the Mount of Olives where you can see the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque directly from a beautiful view. And it's just this little stone cobbled mound next to this cross, and it's where the donkey that Christ rode in on was buried. So if you have plans there, go to visit it. It has not been damaged as far as we're aware, and all of these strikes and violence going on. Dimitri and I were joking about how the fact that the Jews aren't so angered by these golden domes and these crosses just adorning the Mount of Olives shows, I think there's a sort of divine protection. I think the reality of it is obfuscated towards those who may want to do it harm because, so many of those early Zionist inhabitants and people whose descendants are still alive in Israel came from, the post-Pale of Settlement region and came to Israel and the Holy Land supposedly to escape, Orthodox Tsarist oppression. So the fact that something like that is able to stand so strongly in the heart of the Zionist entity right now is very compelling and very strong. So continue to pray for the situation in the Holy Land, of course, the situation in Ukraine, for the abbots and bishops who are being so persecuted, and be sure to enjoy your Palm Sunday as well. We are getting so close to Pascha, ready to feast. I'm sure everybody listening is as well, but Dimitri, I don't know if you have any other stories you want to tell people about, but let's hear your last words.
Yeah, I would just say, in reflection of Lazarus's resurrection and Palm Sunday approaching, it's sort of a reflection of our own personal resurrection at the end of time. All of our resurrection, I would say, all listeners here will be resurrected alongside us. But just recall the calls of the youth and the people of Jerusalem, right? Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel, as they shouted towards Christ, whom, they all heard that he resurrected Lazarus after 4 days and a major miracle has taken place. And they're all greeting Christ as the Messiah, as the King of Israel, they called him directly. And less than a week later, they betrayed him, they cried, crucify him. And this is, I think, a lesson. It's not just about the fallen Jews and the residents of Judea. It is a lesson for us Christians, Orthodox people. Even us, if we witness miracles, there is still a chance of apostasy. There's still our potential falling away. We need to remain loyal, follow the commandments of God, and take it week by week, day by day, but keep things within our own grasp and never lose focus, I would say. And, always stay and keep to the commandments of the Lord, attend feast days, keep the fast, especially there's not much fasting left, right? And soon there'll be Bright Week and Easter upon us. So great celebrations are coming up, regardless of what's taking place geopolitically around the world. So I would just say that is, the Lord does come into our lives, and we just need to, when we do shout, call him the King, and we say Christ is King, he's the King of New Israel, the King of New Zion. We do need to claim that and still live up to his expectations, his commandments, never betraying him like the Jews did in the past, like his own people did, and then they crucified him. So I think that's a very important lesson we all need to live up to. It's not just about all these criminals in world affairs who are conducting their crimes. We need to think about our own transgressions as well. It's not just pointing the finger at others and blaming them. We need to be the kings and the leaders of our own little realms, of our own little worlds, controlling our personal affairs, and become reflections of God in our own little universes, of course, in a sort of cosmological perspective, right? We need to reflect Christ's light to other people and live Christian lives. I think that's the main message moving into the last great week of Great Lent, moving towards Easter and Palm Sunday. I wish everybody a happy celebration and enjoy the feast day.
I really hope everybody is persisting through to the end of the fast and is able to fully enjoy their feast. I hope that everybody has been going to as many services as they can. I know I've been doing my best trying to stay focused on that as opposed to the other distractions of the world. But we live in a world where we are very easily distracted and things are hard to focus on, and especially the important things. But with all of that, I want to thank everybody for listening. worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. That's where you can find us and support us. You can get behind the paywall and listen to every episode of Ether Hour. That is our bonus, interesting history, esoteric, uncensored show where we talk about anything and everything. Our recent episode on Dimitri's massive article about the Romanov ritual regicide is up. It's a fantastic discussion. I hope everybody can tune into that. It'll be linked below. Be sure to also follow us on Twitter, #WorldWarNow_. A lot of things get posted there. We're really growing. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube. That's just World War Now. If you're already listening on there, like the video, subscribe, leave a comment. It really helps us out. Be sure that you're subscribed on both Substack and YouTube. It's one of the best ways to support. Follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. We're growing there as well. We want to, get as many followers so we can do Twitter Spaces and talk to you guys and all these sorts of things. Be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. We've got a lot of breaking news there. So follow us on all these platforms. Get World War Now across all spans of things. And with all of that, thank you so much for listening. Enjoy the end of your Lent, your Palm Sunday, and ultimately your Pascha. And thank you so much again. God bless.